Welcome to the Exploress, time traveling through women's history, one era at a time. I'm Kate Armstrong. Hello, my time-traveling queens. We'll be jumping back into the Viking Age next month, I promise. But before we get there, we're celebrating Pride Month with an interview with Eleanor Medhurst, author of Unsuitable, A History of Lesbian Fashion. Join us as we talk about lesbian dress through the ages, from slightly messy queens to the fabulous clubgoers and performers of the roaring 1920s. Grab a white tuxedo and your favorite monocle. Let's go traveling. Eleanor, hello. Welcome to the Exploress.
Hi, thank you for having me on.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you. Your book was so fascinating, and it's an area of fashion history that I certainly have not gotten to read a lot about, and I learned so much. So, before we get started, could you just introduce your book to us and tell us what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, of course. So, my book is Unsuitable, A History of Lesbian Fashion. And I have a background in fashion history, and I'm also a lesbian. And it was quite apparent to me that lesbian fashion was an area that wasn't really kind of given the attention it deserves. And there's so much that can be said about lesbian communities and identities and self-expression, about politics and visibility through looking at clothes and the way that lesbians or people that we might maybe put in a lesbian history, even if they didn't use the same labels, um, the way the clothing choices that were made and the choices of the ways that people express themselves through fashion, hair, even things like makeup. And that was just kind of the story and a narrative that I wanted to put together and have in one place because I just believed that it deserved attention. And I'd been doing work online, like I've got a blog and social media where I was posting about lesbian fashion history. And I just had such amazing responses to that I knew that people were interested just like I was.
Absolutely. I love your blog. It is a treasure trove, so we'll definitely link to it in the show notes, listeners. So I think there's just so much that you wrote about in your book that we could talk about. We're never going to get to it all, so I think we should just dive right in. So I was hoping we could talk first, kind of work chronologically, and talk a little bit about Queen Christina, who is quite an interesting character. I want to talk about her style as queen. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the deliberately kingly clothing choices that she made?
Yeah, of course. So Queen Christina is such an interesting figure. She was the monarch of Sweden for about 10 years in the 17th century. And she kind of became monarch almost through a loophole. Her father had ensured that she would become the monarch because he hadn't had a son, basically, and he wanted to have that lineage. So she had a lot to live up to, being a queen, but trying to fill king's shoes, basically. And she that came through a lot in the clothes that she wore, in the ways that she presented herself. And we can see that in one example is like her coronation robe. And she had quite a late coronation because there was a lot of planning that went into it. But there'd been robes that had been like passed down before her with kings before her, but she had this new extravagant robe made for her in Paris that was full of like embroidery and gemstones, and it was a really like 10 feet long or something like that. And it was really like making her mark and going, I am the king. I'm Queen Christina and I am the king. And then in her kind of day to day, while she was Queen Christina, Queen of Sweden, she mixed masculine and feminine a lot in her wardrobe. So sort of asserting herself as the queen, but also as the role of king too. And that's really evident in some portraits of her. There's two portraits from, I believe it's 1653, where she's mixing masculine elements of her wardrobe. One of them, she has a like men's shirt underneath a gown, and there's another one where she's on horseback and she's in kind of a riding outfit, which is a very masculine outfit, but it does still have this skirt. So she really asserted her presence and her role as both king and queen through the clothes that she wore during her reign.
So, if we happen to stumble upon her in Rome in the 1650s, and how would her contemporaries have reacted to her style? I mean, was it kind of just considered par for the course, or was it considered shocking?
Yeah, so I said she ruled for a decade, and after that, she abdicated because she didn't want the restrictions of being the queen. She didn't want to marry, she didn't want to have children. There's evidence that she kind of flirted with women quite a lot, so that's possibly part of the way that she wanted to search for freedom as well. And she went off to Rome. She loved the idea of Rome, and she dressed in ways that were very different from when she was the queen. She was a lot more messy, I suppose is one term for it. She was mixing elements of style of masculinity and femininity, but in a way that was a lot less refined. And some of her contemporaries, the people that she met, there are records of people writing about her, and some people would say, oh, she looked a mess, she looked a state, what was she wearing, her wig was disheveled, she had a skirt kind of all over the place. And other people who maybe saw her in a more positive light for one reason or another would say, wow, she was so interesting, she really she had such a presence, she was really asserting herself and making her mark through the clothes that she wore. And I just think it's so interesting that she didn't care what other people thought, and some people took it really positively and others didn't.
Hmm. And it's interesting because it calls to mind, I mean, a very different monarch, but Elizabeth I was pretty famous for incorporating masculine elements into her clothing. But she
Right.
still, I mean, the way she presented as queen was very much like taking up space, but she was still stylized as the virgin queen, sort of calling attention to her femininity too. And I feel like that was more of something like armor she put on in her role. So it's really interesting to me that
Yeah.
Christina, like after she abdicated and she was just in the world dressing, one assumes, for herself, she's still kind of presenting in this really interesting, unconventional way that some might have seen as messy, but others were like, "That's pretty cool." She's like
Yeah.
doing her thing, you know?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's difficult for women in history who have had positions of power because it's kind of uncharted territory. So they've really got to look the part, I suppose. But looking the part wasn't something that they had any references for.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so a bigger question before we move on in time. I wanted to touch base on why it's important to think about how social class affected lesbians throughout history, and specifically in the realm of dress. So, in your book, you mention there's a definite link between dress and identity and safety, and that some working class women couldn't afford to express themselves as freely as upper class women.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, jumping from talking about Queen Christina, the kind of highest class person you can imagine, um, to looking at debates about class and lesbian dress and identity is really interesting because while Christina, for an example, was allowed to do whatever she wanted and damn the consequences, other people, working class lesbians, didn't have that freedom because it might mean that they faced physical violence. It might have meant that they lost their jobs. It might have meant all sorts of kinds of backlash. So there are like lots of instances in more working class lesbian history where fashion or style that went against the norm was maybe restricted to safer spaces like lesbian bars in the 20th century, for example, or where the symbols of a lesbian or non-normative or whatever it might be identity were more subtle, maybe things like rings or accessories rather than like a full extravagant outfit. So, and I think there's also, you've got to take into account the money that is able to be spent on clothing. So there's kind of less freedom in terms of what you can actually wear when you can't, when you don't have access to as many items of clothing, when you like need things for practicality. So I think it's really important to really think about class when thinking about lesbian fashion, queer fashion in history, and also when thinking about like what sources we actually have available to us when we're looking at things like this, because the further back you go, there's less sources from working class people, there's less like written things or paintings or photos even. So you've got to really be aware of the imbalances there.
Okay, so let's dive a little bit into the 1920s and 30s here, one of my favorite eras. So I'm
Yeah.
hoping that you can talk to us a little bit about some of the styles, the monocles and the high collars, the sailor suits, the jackets with
Yeah.
skirts that were so amazing, just so dapper, so amazing, and so popular amongst lesbians at that time, and how adhering to certain unspoken dress codes was really important in lesbian hangout spaces and nightclubs.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved doing the chapter on the 1920s because there were just so many new like movements and so many lesbian spaces, and there was just so much going on in terms of fashion, and part of that is because it's the kind of post World War One setting, and society around the world was really shifting, and people were going, okay, what am I going to make of my life? um in like kind of a prime example for the most extravagant, exciting lesbian fashions in the 20s was Paris. And there was such a thriving lesbian community in Paris during that time that it was nicknamed Paris Lesbos, referring to the island of Lesbos, where the term lesbian comes from because of the poet Sappho who lived there. Um, and yeah, there were lesbian clubs. There was a lesbian club called Le Monocle in Paris. There are some fantastic photos from Le Monocle that were taken in, I believe, 1932 by the photographer Brassai. And one of them's actually on the cover of my book, which is amazing because it's such a dynamic photo. Um, and that's kind of a good place to start when thinking about the fashions that were going on there, because you can see so many of them in this photo and it's great to have that evidence. There are monocles, as you mentioned, and that really works as a sign of affiliation almost with the club because it was called Le Monocle, but it was also recognized as a more widespread lesbian symbol for upper class lesbians, because it wasn't really something that working class women would wear at the time. In fact, there's a really interesting interview from a fashion historian. Well, she used to work as a fashion historian, Katrina Rolli, who interviewed British lesbians between World Wars One and Two about their clothes. And one working class lesbian who she interviewed mentioned, oh, we never wore monocles. Maybe if you were very rich. Instead, we actually had rings on our little finger. So there's kind of the two examples of what people would wear depending on their class situation there. But again, going back to pictures from Le Monocle, you've got sailor suits, and that was kind of a extravagant thing that would maybe just be worn in like lesbian spaces and like nightlife venues. But there was such a fun and exciting language of lesbian fashion going on during that period, and it was just really exciting to delve into and uncover.
Mm. And I thought it was so interesting. You talk about the blues singer Ma Rainey, who we've
Yeah.
covered on the Exploress before. We've listened to her music and talked a little bit about her life. And if you listen to the lyrics of some of her songs, I mean, there were lots of rumors floating around that she was
Yeah.
into the ladies, can't confirm nor deny. But she definitely worked some lyrics in her songs that suggested that that might be the case.
Yeah.
And I believe it was in the advertisement for one of these songs that it shows someone who looks a lot like Ma Rainey wearing a skirt and then a tailored suit jacket and
Mm.
tie over the top and sort of talking to two women in what looks like a suggestive way, which was just really fascinating to me to see an example of this kind of fashion and a woman this famous, and especially in America, a Black
Yeah.
woman in America representing in this way and kind of talking in this way about sexuality.
Absolutely. And it was quite a shameless example. The advert was for the song Prove It On Me Blues, and the song itself references the styles that are in the picture from the advert. It says, "It's true, I wear a collar and tie." And then the whole song is kind of a cheeky wink at the rumors that were flying around, because it's like the lyrics are like, they say that I do this, but prove it, prove it. And it's excellent that she makes these references, and maybe she was, maybe she wasn't, but she certainly wasn't bothered by the rumors and took them in her stride. And the kind of tailored jacket and the tailored skirt, the very masculine look but completed with the skirt, so that kind of line between what was acceptable or not, was such an established thing in lesbian fashion, and it comes up time and time again across the globe. And it was great to see it in that advert as this very deliberate reference to
Mm.
queerness.
Absolutely. And speaking of, let's talk about Gladys Bentley. So, this is another nightclub performer who became really famous for wearing like a full, just, amazing suit outfits and was like
Yeah.
really larger than life on the stage. Can you tell us a little bit, if we went to a Gladys Bentley show, what they might have been
Yeah.
wearing?
Gladys Bentley is such an interesting figure. Again, as you said, another blues singer and performer, male impersonator from the Harlem Renaissance. And in the book, I often refer to Bentley with they them pronouns, because their gender was so like in flux throughout their life. Um, but during their performances at kind of the height of their career, they wrote about having different like tuxedo sets. So these kind of silk tuxedos, top hats and canes in different colors. And it was this such a polished, um, theatrical almost persona on stage. But that was very close to the kinds of clothes that Bentley wore off the stage as well. Less polished and theatrical, I imagine. Not no kind of cane and top hat walking down the street, but they would dress in these male clothes, these masculine clothes in their day to day life as well, and often apparently with a woman in a beautiful dress walking along on their arm as well. So they really kind of exemplified what was seen by the world as a performance, but because they were so good at it, they were able to bring that into their everyday as well, which is really fascinating.
And it's interesting to me too because I feel like all the research are done on the 1920s. We have this picture. I think a lot of people have this picture of women in the 1920s as we're starting to wear pants, which is kind
Yeah.
of true, but also not really true at all. Like we do see women wearing pants in specific spaces, in
Mm.
specific instances, but you dig into it and it's like, well, they're wearing like pajama style beach pants on the beach. They're wearing them at home, but mostly in private spaces, mostly in
Mm.
clubs. You don't actually see a lot of women walking down the street
Yeah.
in pants because it was still considered pretty scandalous. So, would you say that that was true of the lesbian community too? Like you said, is this mostly still in private spaces, or do you think there were instances where they were trying to bring it into the public sphere?
Yeah, I think again it was mostly in private spaces, but it depended, like I was saying earlier, on I suppose the privileges that people had, like what they were able to get away with and what they were willing to risk. Because you don't know what the reaction's going to be. And I think it also depends on location and what people are how people are likely to react, I suppose. Um, so people who were like Gladys Bentley, who were almost larger than life figures, could get away with it more than people who were just normal, everyday people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Some of
Yeah.
these famous people, like Ma Rainey, could get away with a lot because she was this
Yeah.
really famous blues performer and she was
Yeah.
playful and blues was playful. And so she could say things on the stage and in her music and kind of express herself in such a way that she had the power to do that a lot of people wouldn't have.
Yeah.
So that
But
makes sense.
also, yeah, during the Harlem Renaissance in Harlem, it was such a, obviously not everyone was going to agree with queerness of any kind and with eccentricity, but lots of people did and didn't care. So it was one of these spaces where people could go onto the streets a bit more and their community would let them be who they were more than in some other situations.
Mm. Okay, so let's take another step back again. I'm hoping we can talk about the labels butch and femme,
Mm.
specifically their differences in the context of uncovering lesbian history. So I think, what do these mean in the realm of your work and what do we need to understand about them when we're trying to understand fashion
Yeah.
history?
So butch and femme are, in kind of the most simple terms, if you're just completely unsure, are butch kind of refers to a masculine woman or lesbian, and femme to a feminine lesbian woman. But there's so much more that can be said about both of them than that. They can be very, very complex identities. They can relate to someone's sense of self, their sense of self presentation and style, the relationship dynamic that they kind of prefer or want to be in. And for some people, it might be a very ingrained part of themselves. And for others, it's just kind of almost a costume that someone might have put on for the night just to kind of go to the lesbian club. And that's something that still rings true for some people today, but it was kind of at its peak. The butch and femme subculture, let's call it, was kind of at its peak in the 40s to 60s, I suppose, in North America, but also in other contexts too. Um, there's yeah, butch and femme is just such a interesting area of lesbian fashion history because it was such a clear example of lesbian self-styling, and so often it was in these spaces that we know were lesbian spaces that were specifically lesbian clubs. So it's like an example of a time where we can look at people in the historical record, maybe in photos or stuff like that, and say, yes, those are some lesbians. What were they doing? What were they wearing? What can we learn about them? What do we know?
Hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting to think about. I mean, from your perspective, you have to do a lot of detective work because, as you say, often when you're looking through the records and you're looking at images, it's like, well, how can I be sure that this
Mm,
person was a lesbian? I mean, you're looking at often the information that you're able to glean about, like, well, this was a lesbian club.
yeah.
So that helps to narrow it down. You can't be
Mm,
sure otherwise. And like perhaps the way someone presents in a lesbian club is not what they're going to be wearing on the day to day. And how might
yeah.
that change your interpretation of the clothes? So like must be a really interesting form of detective work to do. And I imagine when we're talking about kind of the femme look,
Yeah.
we're also talking about a look that a lot of people might be wearing who aren't lesbians too. So it's kind of like they almost become invisible, I imagine. Like there's a lot of what we might call lesbian fashion that might it goes invisible. It runs under the surface of what you do. And so
Yeah.
how do you deal with that?
I mean, again, as I was saying, with the looking at a specific context and kind of gleaning clues from that, there's a lot of, I suppose, when looking at lesbian fashion history, some of the most obvious examples for me are more masculine lesbians, people who are butches, we might call them. Um, because even if you don't know all the details of that person's life, the clothes that they're wearing kind of points them as going, okay, you're kind of going against the grain of what fashions were expected of women. So let's look at you. Let's find out more about your life. Who are you? Were you gay? Like, let's see what communities you were in, etc., etc. With women dressing in more feminine clothes that are maybe more aligned with all of the people around them, it's harder to see that difference and to kind of point at it as a flag and dig deeper. So for femmes or feminine people, even if they maybe weren't using the label femme, um, there can be that sense of invisibility, which is why they appear more, I suppose, in situations like lesbian clubs, in butch and femme relationships, where the difference is more visible, I suppose. And there's a really good kind of point made by the scholar Joan Nessel, who's quite a feminist femme scholar. She was one of the co-founders of the Lesbian Herstory archives in New York City. And she wrote a piece, I think, in the 80s, talking about how butch and femme as a relationship dynamic and as two people who might walk down the street together made lesbians visible in a very kind of political way, because people would look at them and say, oh, those are lesbians. Look at how they're dressing. Look at how they're walking around together. And femme visibility in that context was, as I said, very political and really helped move the lesbian movement and lesbian rights and lesbian visibility forward.
Mm. Okay, so since we're talking about politics, let's talk a little bit about the British suffragette movement. So,
Sure.
why were lesbians considered such a threat to the movement? And how did the suffragettes harness the power of fashion and fashion
Yeah.
branding to get their point across?
The suffragettes are really interesting. I'm writing in the book in Unsuitable, I have one chapter all about kind of lesbian politics and activism, and most of it is later 20th century, but I do have one part that's looking at the suffragettes, the women's suffrage movement of the early 20th century. And a big part of the suffrage movement and the suffragettes in the UK was a sense of respectability and of being very up to date with fashion. And there was, as you said, a emphasis on branding themselves through their clothes. And a big part of that was their color scheme, which was white, purple, and green. And they even got like department stores on board who would sell accessories, bits and pieces in the purple, white, and green color scheme. And being a very polished, respectable woman was a huge part of the suffragette campaign and the suffragette movement. And it would almost work to disguise the less respectable things they were doing below the surface. Things like setting fire to post boxes is like one example of something that suffragettes did. So masculine women, people who presented themselves in a more masculine way or acted in what might have been considered a more masculine way, such as having relationships with other women, were kind of seen as a threat, and they were a chance for things like newspapers to caricature suffragettes and to show them in a less positive, less respectable light. But that didn't mean, like, there were still many people in the movement who had relationships with women who might have done based on the evidence we have, or who dressed in more masculine ways. And sometimes they were still quite central, like Jack Holm, who was a chauffeur for some really famous suffragettes like the Pankhursts. And she dressed in very masculine ways because she was a chauffeur. It was like a kind of practical clothes, but then she wore them throughout her life as well. And the composer Ethel Smythe was a huge figure in the suffragette movement, and she dressed in more masculine leaning clothes as well. Sometimes they were described as being hideous. And these are people who aren't as prominent in the kind of imagery of the suffragette movement, but they were still very much there. They just kind of were brushed out of the way because they didn't really fit the preferred image.
And it's so interesting because you wonder, well, why don't I know about these people? Why haven't I seen images? And it is because they tended to be shoved to the side because they didn't, as you say, didn't fit this neat image and this neat narrative. It was like, you're complicating things. So
Yeah.
please step to the side out of the picture. But it means that they got lost in the
Yeah.
shuffle of history. So, can you please describe the dyke uniform and how groups like the Lavender Menace used fashion as a form of activism?
Of course. So the dyke uniform is kind of a colloquialism, I suppose. Another term is the androgynous uniform for the clothes worn by lesbian feminists in the later 20th century. So that might involve um, practical casual clothes like t-shirts and jeans, like dungarees or overalls, things that weren't super fashionable and feminine and that were almost protest clothes because of that, because they weren't aligning with fashionability and femininity. And wearing clothes like that was a really big part of the feminist movement, the women's movement, but the lesbian feminist movement specifically. And people who didn't align with that would sometimes be quite ostracized. If people wanted to wear dresses, for instance, it wasn't always approved of within kind of political lesbian spaces. And that links to some kind of specific aspects or specific instances of lesbian activism, and the Lavender Menace is one of them. So the Lavender Menace were a group who formed in 1970 in the US in New York after the famous feminist Betty Friedan made a comment saying that lesbians were a lavender menace within the women's movement, kind of saying that they were a threat. They were taking attention away from the important aspects of the feminist movement. And lesbian feminists weren't having any of it and decided to infiltrate a feminist conference that was taking place in New York in May 1970, wearing t-shirts that they had hand dyed lavender and stenciled with the words Lavender Menace. And it's just such an interesting story. They infiltrate this conference and like manage to turn all the lights off and whip their overshirts off and have their stand up and all be wearing their Lavender Menace t-shirts. Um, and they just derailed the entire day and were up on the stage talking about their experiences as lesbians while wearing these t-shirts that kind of labeled them as something that had been meant to be kind of derogatory, but that was being reclaimed. And I just love it from like a fashion history perspective because it's a time when activism and fashion and kind of handcrafting as well were all tied together to make a really important point.
I love it. And what a great name, the Lavender Menace. I would want to
Yeah.
take ownership of it too, I think.
Yeah, it's really interesting because they were originally called, well, not they were originally called, the original label was they were lavender herrings, I believe. A different feminist had said that in a way that was like, don't worry about the lesbians. It's fine. They're just a red herring, but a lavender herring, because lavender has kind of queer connotations. And Betty Friedan had gone, it might have been the other way around, was like, no, they're a menace. Um, but the Lavender Menace group went for Lavender Menace rather than herring because they were like, well, we'll own being a menace.
Yeah, absolutely. As you would.
Yeah.
Ah. Well, if there's one thing that readers definitely come away with from your book is that lesbian fashion history, it's incredibly diverse and you can't truly define it. Is there anything else that you're hoping that our listeners will leave thinking about today, or perhaps something they might discover if they pick up your book?
Yeah, I mean, the book, what I really wanted to do with it was be almost a starting point for lesbian fashion history. As I was saying earlier on, there really wasn't any examples of lesbian fashion history being the focus. In histories about lesbian life, fashion might be mentioned. There are some examples of books or media or exhibitions about queer fashion, and lesbians kind of appear a little bit. But I just really wanted a space to focus on lesbian fashion and consider why it can be so important and in some cases almost life changing. But it's very much the start because there are lesbian fashion choices being made all across the world, in some form or another, whether people are using the label lesbian or not. It's kind of like it's a daisy chain almost, is a way that I describe it in the book, a daisy chain of lesbian fashion that's being like built up and built up. And Unsuitable is kind of a beginning of chronicling that. And as you pointed out, it covers a diverse range of lesbian fashions. There are 18 chapters, all based on a different community or person or style or time. But there's so much more. So I suppose what I'm saying is that I hope people realize that it's just the start. There's so many forms of lesbian fashion expression throughout the world. And that's something that I want to continue developing and expanding, going forward, because there's only so much you can cover in one thing. And I just hope that people keep their minds open to like why fashion and style is important within marginalized communities, I suppose, and within politics, and that fashion and politics aren't these two completely unrelated spheres. There's so much significance to the clothes that we wear.
There really is. And anyone who has listened to more than 3 episodes of The Exploress will absolutely know that fashion is politics. So, okay,
Yeah.
I have one more question for you. And it's just a fun one to end with. If you could time travel back for a day to any time and place, you don't have to worry about disease. You'll be fine. Where would you go?
Oh, it's a difficult one. Because, there's always positives and negatives. Disease is one. It's good I wouldn't have to worry about it. But, there's always other struggles that people face. But I
Yes,
think
of course.
I would love to go to Le Monocle. I would love to insert myself into the picture that's on the front of my book from Le Monocle in 1932 and see what was going on there and dress up and just be part of it. Like, that would be a really, really fantastic day, I think, a fantastic moment.
It would be amazing. Yeah. For listeners, go and check out that picture because it does look like they are having the time of their lives.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Eleanor. This has been fantastic. Thank you for talking to us about Unsuitable.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy to go through the journey with you.
Thank you so much to Eleanor for joining us, and to Carly Quinn for her help producing this episode. Eleanor's book, Unsuitable, is out wherever great books are sold. And now, as a little extra treat, I give you Ma Rainey's very lesbian-coded 1928 song, Prove It On Me. To find out more about the fabulous Ma, go back and listen to our episode on the jazz singers of the 1920s. Until next time.
Everything seems to go around. I looked up to my surprise. The gal I was with was gone. Where she went, I don't know. I mean to follow everywhere she goes. Folks said I'm crooked. I didn't know where she took it. I want the whole world to know. They say I do it, ain't nobody caught me. Sure got to prove it on me. Went out last night with a crowd of my friends. They must send women, 'cause I don't like no men. It's true I wear color.